I never imagined that restoring an old barn on my own property would lead to a full-blown war with my homeowners association president. But that's exactly what happened. It all started because I love old things with history etched into their bones. My house sat on a 3-acre plot, the last remnant of what was once a sprawling farm on the edge of town. The developer who built the rest of the neighborhood in the 90s had carved up the land, but for some reason, the original farmhouse and its magnificent stone and timber barn were left on this larger parcel. That was the reason I bought the place 10 years ago. My business is landscaping and small-scale construction, so I appreciate things that are built to last. The barn was my magnum opus in waiting. It was from the late 1700s, according to the purchase documents, a pre-Revolutionary War structure with hand-hewn beams the size of tree trunks and fieldstone walls that were 2 feet thick. It was weathered and worn, a few slates missing from the roof, and the great wooden doors hanging slightly askew, but it was solid. It was beautiful. For years, it was my private cathedral of history, a place I'd go to think, storing my equipment in one corner and dreaming of the day I'd have the time and money to bring it back to its former glory. Our neighborhood, Oak Creek Estates, was a quiet place for most of that time. The HOA was mostly a formality, a sleepy entity that collected dues to maintain the front entrance sign and organize a yearly block party. Board meetings were sparsely attended, if they happened at all. We were a community of people who mostly wanted to be left alone to mow our lawns and live our lives. We waved when we passed each other, we borrowed cups of sugar, and we respected boundaries. It was a simple, unspoken covenant of neighborliness that worked just fine. That all changed the day Carol moved in. She bought the new-build house on the corner lot, a beige box that was identical to 3 others on the same street. From the moment her moving truck arrived, she seemed to view the neighborhood not as a home, but as a project to be managed. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a perpetually pursed expression, and an unnerving amount of energy that she channeled exclusively into finding fault with others. Within 6 months, Carol had attended her first HOA meeting. Within 7, she had successfully campaigned to have the entire old board, a group of tired retirees who were happy to be relieved of duty, vote her in as president. She ran on a platform of protecting our property values and upholding community standards. It all sounded reasonable enough on paper, and most of us were too busy with our own lives to pay much attention. We just shrugged and figured it meant the front entrance might get new flowers more often. We were fools. The changes started small, almost too petty to protest. An email went out, formatted in a crisp, professionally aggressive font. Mailboxes had to be a specific model and color, purchased from an approved vendor. A week later, another email. Garbage cans could not be visible from the street except on collection day, effective immediately. Then came the regulations on lawn ornamentation, the approved species of shrubs for front-facing flower beds, and the precise shade of white for window trim. Each new rule was a little tighter, a little more restrictive. It was like a boa constrictor slowly wrapping itself around the neighborhood. People grumbled, but no one wanted to be the one to officially complain and draw Carol's attention. Her presence was constant. She'd walk her small, yapping dog multiple times a day, her eyes scanning every yard, every roofline, a clipboard sometimes materializing in her hands as if from thin air. She wasn't just observing, she was inspecting. My next-door neighbor, Arthur, a retired history professor in his 70s, found it all darkly amusing at first. "She's a textbook tyrant," he'd chuckle over the fence separating our yards. All the misplaced ambition of a failed CEO channeled into the governance of a half-mile suburban loop. It would be fascinating if it weren't so irritating. Arthur had lived in his house since it was built, and he, like me, cherished the neighborhood's live-and-let-live character. My first direct, albeit minor, run-in with Carol came about a year into her reign. I had a client's dump truck deliver a load of mulch to my driveway for a big landscaping job the next day. It was clean, contained, and scheduled to be gone by noon. At 7 in the morning, my doorbell rang insistently. It was Carol, holding her clipboard like a scepter. "Mark," she said, without any preamble, "you have a commercial vehicle parked in your driveway. That's a violation of Section 12, subsection C of the bylaws. I blinked at her, still half asleep. It's a delivery, Carol. It will be gone in a few hours. She tapped her pen on the clipboard. The rules are clear. No commercial vehicles overnight. I saw it here at 10 post-meridian last night. That's an automatic $50 fine. I just stared at her. You're going to fine me for getting a delivery for my business. The business that lets me afford to live here and pay the HOA dues you're so fond of spending. A flicker of something cold passed through her eyes. The rules are for everyone, she said, and with that, she turned and marched away. A week later, a bill for $50 arrived in my mailbox. I paid it just to make it go away, but the sheer pettiness of it left a sour taste in my mouth. That incident, however, was just the prelude. The real war began last spring. After years of saving and planning, I was finally ready to start the restoration of my barn. It wasn't a renovation. I wasn't changing the footprint or turning it into a living space. I was simply going to repair it, to make it sound and whole again. I planned to replace the rotten timbers with period-appropriate wood, repoint the old stonework, and fix the slate roof. It was a labor of love, a project I intended to do myself, piece by piece, on weekends. The first weekend, I started by carefully removing the old rotted doors. I wanted to use them as a template to build new ones that were identical in style. I had the massive doors laid out on sawhorses in my driveway, and I was meticulously measuring the joinery when Carol's shadow fell over me. "What is going on here?" she demanded. Her tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. I straightened up, wiping sawdust from my hands. "Good morning, Carol. I'm starting the repairs on the barn." I gestured toward the magnificent old structure, going to bring it back to life. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the barn, then my tools, then the doors. "You can't do this," she stated flatly. It wasn't a question, it was a decree. I confess, I laughed. I couldn't help it. "What do you mean I can't do this? It's my barn, on my property." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "This is an unapproved structural modification. All exterior projects, modifications, or new constructions must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval. Which is me," she added, with a thin, triumphant smile. I tried to be reasonable. I really did. "Carol, this isn't a new construction. It's a repair. I'm fixing what's already here. The bylaws don't say I need permission to replace a rotten board or a broken window." Her smile vanished. "You are removing primary structural elements," she said, pointing a rigid finger at the door opening. "That requires a full submission. Plans, material lists, contractor licenses, and a project timeline. And frankly," she added, her gaze sweeping over the barn with open disgust, "I can tell you right now, it will not be approved." I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. "What do you mean it won't be approved?" She crossed her arms, looking smug. "That thing," she said, waving a dismissive hand at my beautiful barn, "is an eyesore. It doesn't conform to community standards. It's dilapidated, unsightly, and it's dragging down the property values of everyone in this neighborhood. The committee's position is that the structure should be demolished, not repaired." I was speechless. Demolished. She wanted me to tear down a piece of history, a structure that had stood on this land since before the United States was even a country, because it didn't match her beige, vinyl-sided vision of suburbia. "You're out of your mind," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I am not tearing down my barn." "Then you will cease all work immediately," she snapped. "You will receive a formal stop work order this afternoon. If you continue, you will be fined $100 per day. If the fines are not paid, the association will place a lien on your property. We have the authority. Read your bylaws." She spun on her heel and marched back toward her house, her back ramrod straight. I stood there in my driveway, the scent of old wood in the air, and I knew this was no longer about mailboxes or garbage cans. This was a declaration of war. True to her word, a letter was taped to my front door that afternoon. It was professionally printed on HOA letterhead, citing half a dozen different bylaws I was supposedly violating. It formally ordered me to cease all work on the unapproved outbuilding and warned of the $100 daily fine. There was a final, chilling sentence. Failure to comply will result in escalating penalties, including legal action to compel the removal of the non-compliant structure at the homeowner's expense. My initial disbelief curdled into a hard, cold knot of anger. This was my home, my property. The barn was one of the main reasons I bought it. The idea that this woman, this newcomer with a lust for petty power, could force me to tear it down was fundamentally, profoundly wrong. I spent the rest of the day in a state of simmering rage, pacing my kitchen and rereading the letter, each word an insult. I decided on a course of passive resistance. I wasn't going to do any more work on the barn for now, but I certainly wasn't going to submit any plans for its demolition. I put the old doors inside the barn out of sight and went about my week, running my business and trying to ignore the constant, simmering conflict. Every day I saw Carol on her patrol, slowing down as she passed my house, her eyes fixed on the barn as if willing it to crumble. The fines started immediately. A week after the first letter, I received an invoice in the mail for $700. For violation, unauthorized construction, 7 days at $100 per day. It was absurd. I hadn't touched the barn since she confronted me. I was being fined for a state of existence, for simply owning the structure she had decided she didn't like. I threw the bill on my counter, a growing monument to her insanity. The conflict began to spill over, affecting others. My neighbor on the other side, Mrs. Gable, was an elderly widow in her 80s. Her late husband had been an avid birdwatcher, and she kept his tradition alive with a series of charming, handcrafted birdhouses and a feeder in her backyard. One afternoon, I saw Carol in Mrs. Gable's yard, pointing and speaking in a sharp, accusatory tone. Later that day, Mrs. Gable called me, her voice trembling. "Mark, I don't know what to do," she said, clearly distressed. "That woman, the president, she gave me a notice. She said my bird feeder is attracting vermin and the birdhouses are unapproved structures. She wants me to take them all down or she'll fine me." The thought of this sweet old woman, who found joy in watching her finches and cardinals, being bullied over birdhouses made my blood boil. It was cruel and pointless. "Don't you worry about it, Mrs. Gable," I told her, my voice full of a confidence I didn't quite feel. "Let me handle it." I went over to Carol's house that evening and rang her bell. She opened the door with a look of sour triumph. "Here to pay your fines?" she asked. "I'm here about Mrs. Gable," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could. "You need to leave her alone. She's an 84-year-old widow, and her birdhouses aren't hurting anyone." Carol sniffed dismissively. "She is in violation. The rules apply to everyone, regardless of age. We must maintain standards. Her yard is cluttered." "It's not cluttered, it's loved," I shot back. "This has gone too far, Carol. This isn't about standards anymore. This is about you bullying people." Her face hardened into a mask of pure venom. "You are in no position to lecture me about rules, Mark. Your fines are now up to $1,200. And since you're so concerned with Mrs. Gable, perhaps I'll have the committee review the state of her exterior paint and the crack in her driveway as well. We have to be thorough." It was a direct threat. She was telling me that if I defended my neighbors, she would use the full power of her office to make their lives miserable. It was a classic bully tactic. Isolate your target and punish anyone who tries to help them. I walked away from her door that night, feeling a profound sense of disgust, but also something new. A cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about my entire community. The next letter that arrived was from the HOA's law firm. It informed me that my unpaid fines had reached over $2,000, and that if they were not paid within 30 days, the association would be filing a lien against my property. A lien. That was real. That could prevent me from selling my house, or even allow them to foreclose on it to collect the debt. The absurdity had crossed a dangerous line into a genuine threat to my financial security, to my home. That was the moment I knew I couldn't fight this alone. My attempts at reason had failed. My passive resistance was only making things worse. I was a landscaper, not a lawyer. I was out of my depth. I needed professional help. I remembered a client from a few years back, a sharp corporate lawyer named Ms. Davies, for whom I'd done a major garden installation. She was no-nonsense, intelligent, and had seemed to appreciate my straightforward approach to business. I found her number and made the call. I sat in Miss Davies' polished downtown office the next day, a stack of letters and fine notices on the mahogany desk between us. She listened patiently, her face impassive, as I laid out the whole story, from the mailboxes to the birdhouses to the threat of the lien on my barn. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. "Well, mister," she began, and I noted she didn't use abbreviations. "This is a classic case of what we call the petty tyrant syndrome. It's depressingly common in homeowners associations. You get one person with a lust for control and a board that's either too lazy or too intimidated to stop them." She picked up the lien threat letter. "This is a serious escalation. They can, in fact, do this. HOAs have broad powers granted by the covenants you agreed to when you bought your home. Fighting them can be like fighting a ghost. The board is insulated, and they're using your own money, your dues, to pay the lawyers to sue you." My heart sank. "So I have to give in? Tear down the barn?" She held up a hand. "I didn't say that. I said it's difficult, not impossible. Bullies like this, they rely on intimidation and the assumption that you'll just roll over. They often get sloppy. Her power comes from the bylaws, so that's where we need to look. We need to find a rule she's broken, a procedure she's failed to follow, or, ideally, a piece of leverage she doesn't even know exists." She tapped a pen on my file. "This whole thing started with the barn. You say it's old. How old?" "Late 1700s, I said. "It was part of the original farmstead before the town even existed." Ms. Davies' eyebrows shot up. "Really? That old? Have you ever looked into its official history? County records, historical societies, anything like that?" I admitted I hadn't. I just knew what the previous owner had told me and what I could see with my own eyes. "That's your homework," she said, her voice suddenly energized. "Forget the HOA bylaws for a minute. Let's look at a higher authority. Go to the county records office. Look for the property's plat history, any surveys, any deeds going back as far as you can. Look for easements, covenants, or designations that might be attached to the land itself, things that predate the HOA. An entity like an HOA, which is barely 30 years old, cannot override a county or state-level designation that's been on the books for longer. Go digging. See if your barn is more than just an old building." Her advice was a lifeline. It was a new direction, a proactive strategy instead of just reacting to Carol's attacks. The conversation shifted my mindset from that of a victim to that of an investigator. I left her office feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was on a treasure hunt for the truth of its history. That weekend, I told my neighbor Arthur about my meeting with the lawyer and my new mission. His eyes, usually twinkling with academic amusement, lit up with genuine excitement. "Brilliant," he exclaimed. "A primary source investigation. This is history in action, my boy. The county archive is a fascinating place. Dusty, but fascinating. I'll go with you. I know some of the people who work there. A second pair of eyes is always useful when you're wading through centuries of bureaucratic paperwork." So, on Monday morning, Arthur and I drove to the county administrative building, a formidable granite structure downtown. The records archive was in the basement, a climate-controlled room that smelled of old paper and dust. It was filled with rows of rolling metal shelves, crammed with enormous, leather-bound ledgers and boxes of microfilm. A clerk, a stern-looking woman who seemed to be a permanent fixture of the place, gave us a suspicious look. Arthur, however, worked his magic. He remembered the clerk's name from a previous research trip years ago, asked about her family, and charmed her into a state of grudging helpfulness. Soon we were set up at a large wooden table with a stack of plat maps and deed books that dated back to the early 20th century. It was slow, tedious work. The handwriting in the old ledgers was a beautiful but often illegible script. We traced the ownership of my parcel back, deed by deed, owner by owner. We saw the land change hands from a farmer named Miller to a developer in the 50s who went bankrupt, then to another family who held it for 30 years before the current development began. The barn was mentioned in every deed, a permanent fixture of the property description. But there was nothing special, no designation, no protection. My heart began to sink. Maybe this was a dead end. "Don't lose hope," Arthur said, peering through a large magnifying glass at a fragile map from the 1920s. "The official record is only one part of the story. Let's check the minutes from the county commission meetings and the records of the Historical Preservation Society. Sometimes these things are created by committee action and only referenced in the deeds later, if at all." He led me to a different section of the archive, one filled with cardboard boxes labeled by year. This was even more tedious. We were looking for any mention of the Miller farmstead or the property address in decades worth of public meeting minutes. We spent hours poring over microfilm, our eyes burning from the glowing green text. We found discussions about zoning changes, road planning, and all manner of municipal business, but nothing about my barn. By late afternoon, I was ready to give up. My head ached. I had spent a whole day on what felt like a wild goose chase, while Carol's finds were continuing to mount. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. "It's no use, Arthur. There's nothing here. It's just an old barn, and I'm going to have to either tear it down or get buried in legal fees." Arthur wasn't listening. He was frozen, his finger pressed against the microfilm reader's screen. "Wait a minute," he whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "Wait just 1 minute. Mark, look at this." I leaned forward. He was pointing to a block of text on the screen, the minutes from a County Historical Preservation Society meeting. The date at the top of the page was July 8, 1976. "As part of the county's bicentennial celebration initiatives," he read aloud, his voice gaining strength, "the Society has voted to approve the following sites for inclusion on the County Register of Historic Landmarks, granting them protection against demolition or significant unapproved alteration under County Ordinance 7614. He scrolled down a short list of sites: a one-room schoolhouse, an old iron bridge, and then, there it was, the third item on the list, the Miller Farmstead Barn, located at 412 Old Mill Road. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. 412 Old Mill Road. That was my address. The Miller Farmstead Barn. That was my barn. It was right there, in black and white, or rather, glowing green and black. A protected historic landmark, designated in 1976, nearly 2 decades before Oak Creek Estates and its petty HOA even existed. "We found it," I breathed, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Arthur, you magnificent man, we found it." He patted my shoulder, a broad smile on his own face. "I told you, history is a weapon, my boy, and you just found a cannon." We asked the clerk to help us find the ordinance itself, 76-14. It was clear and unambiguous. Any designated landmark was protected. Any attempt to demolish it or alter its historic character without a permit from the County Preservation Commission was illegal and subject to heavy fines, payable to the county. The ordinance superseded any and all local covenants or private agreements. We immediately paid for certified copies of the meeting minutes and the ordinance. Holding the stamped, official papers in my hand felt like holding a shield and a sword. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Carol wasn't just being a bully anymore. She was actively, if unknowingly, demanding that I break the law. And she was doing it in writing, as president of the HOA. My strategy changed instantly. I was no longer on the defensive, trying to justify my actions. I was now on the offense. I didn't call Carol. I didn't send her a letter. That would have been playing on her terms. Instead, I saw on the community website that the quarterly HOA general meeting was scheduled for the following week. The agenda, posted by Carol, included a special session. Review and action regarding non-compliant structure at 412 Old Mill Road. She was planning to use the meeting to publicly shame me and get the community's backing to move forward with the lien and legal action. It was the perfect stage. I spent the next week preparing. I called Miss Davies and told her what I'd found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she let out a low whistle. "That's not a smoking gun, mister," she said, a rare hint of glee in her voice. "That is a nuclear bomb. This is beautiful. Don't do anything until the meeting. Let her walk right into it. Let her make her case in front of everyone. The public humiliation will be far more effective than any letter I could write. I also spent some time talking to my neighbors. I didn't reveal my trump card, but I did share my frustration with Carol's overreach. I spoke with the family who had been fined for having a basketball hoop that was left out overnight. I talked to the young couple who got a warning because their wind chimes were deemed a noise nuisance. And of course, I checked in on Mrs. Gable, who had reluctantly taken down her birdhouses. For each person, I said the same thing. There's an HOA meeting next Tuesday. I think it's important that as many of us as possible are there. It's time our voices were heard. The night of the meeting arrived. It was held in the small clubhouse by the community pool. Usually, these meetings drew maybe 10 people, mostly the board and a few lonely retirees. Tonight, the room was packed. I saw at least 50 people, a mix of faces I knew and some I didn't. There was a low buzz of discontent in the air. People were crammed into folding chairs, standing along the walls. My quiet campaign had worked. The community was restless. Carol and her two loyal board members, a meek-looking man named Gary and a sour-faced woman named Brenda, sat at a folding table at the front. Carol seemed energized by the large crowd, likely misinterpreting their presence as support for her crusade. She banged a small gavel to bring the meeting to order. They went through the usual business, the treasurer's report, the landscaping committee update, with an air of forced normalcy. Carol was beaming, clearly enjoying her position of authority. Finally, she came to the main event. And now, she announced, her voice ringing with self-importance. We move to the special agenda item regarding the property at 412 Old Mill Road. She shuffled her papers and put on a pair of reading glasses, adopting a somber expression. As you all know, the board is tasked with upholding the standards that protect our community and our investments. For months, we have been dealing with a serious and persistent violation by the owner, Mark. She proceeded to lay out her case against me. She spoke of the unauthorized, dilapidated outbuilding. She waved copies of the violation notices. She talked about my refusal to cooperate and my blatant disregard for the rules that we all agree to live by. She painted a picture of me as a rogue homeowner, a bad neighbor whose selfish actions were threatening the very fabric of their manicured paradise. The structure is an eyesore and a safety hazard, she declared, her voice rising. It does not meet community aesthetic guidelines. We have repeatedly asked the owner to submit a plan for its removal, and he has refused. The fines have now accrued to over $4,000. Therefore, the board is asking for the community's support tonight to authorize our legal counsel to place a lien on the property and seek a court order to have the non-compliant structure removed at the owner's expense. A hush fell over the room. She had laid it all out. She was asking for their permission to legally force me to tear down my barn. She looked around the room, expecting nods of agreement. "Are there any questions before we vote?" she asked, a smug little smile playing on her lips. I slowly raised my hand. "I have a statement, not a question," I said, my voice calm and clear. Carol's eyes narrowed. "Fine, Mark. You have 2 minutes to explain your non-compliance." She clearly expected me to beg or argue, which would only make her look more powerful. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a simple manila folder. I stood next to her table, but I addressed the crowd, my neighbors. "My name is Mark, and I live at 412 Old Mill Road. Carol is right about one thing. I have refused to tear down my barn. But I'd like to provide some context that she seems to have overlooked in her quest for community standards." I opened the folder. Carol is demanding I demolish what she calls a dilapidated outbuilding. What she has failed to understand is that this is not just an outbuilding. This is the Miller Farmstead barn. It was built circa 1780. It has stood on that piece of land for nearly 250 years. I let that sink in for a moment. A few people in the audience murmured to each other. "Now, Carol is a big believer in rules," I continued, looking directly at her now. "So I decided to do some research into some other rules, not just the HOAs, but the counties." I pulled out the first document, the certified copy of the meeting minutes. "This," I said, holding it up for everyone to see, "is a copy of the minutes from the County Historical Preservation Society meeting on July 8, 1976. As part of the bicentennial celebration, they designated the Miller Farmstead Barn as a protected county historic landmark. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Carol's smug smile had frozen on her face. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. I then held up the second document, and this is a certified copy of County Ordinance 76-14, the law that gives that designation its teeth. It states, and I quote, "Any designated landmark is protected from demolition or significant alteration without a permit from the Preservation Commission." It also states that any person or entity that seeks to compel such a demolition is in violation of the ordinance. I paused, letting the weight of the words fill the room. "So, to be perfectly clear," I said, my voice like ice, "Carol, in her official capacity as president of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association, has been sending me official, legally threatening letters, fining me thousands of dollars, and is now asking you to authorize legal action to force me to commit an illegal act." The room erupted. It wasn't just murmuring now, it was a wave of shocked, angry voices. Carol was pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her two board members looked horrified, as if the table they were sitting at was on fire. That's not possible," Carol stammered. "It's not true." "Oh, it's very true," I said, placing the certified, stamped, and sealed documents on the table in front of her. "Feel free to inspect them, they're public record, and I have to assume that the county's fines for violating a historic preservation ordinance are significantly higher than your little $100-a-day penalty. I wonder if the HOA's insurance covers knowingly demanding a homeowner break the law." That was the breaking point. Arthur stood up. "I was with Mark at the archives. It's all true." "This isn't about standards, it's about a vendetta." Then Mrs. Gable, her voice small but firm, stood up. "She made me take down my birdhouses." Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, shouting their own stories of Carol's petty tyranny. The man with the basketball hoop, the couple with the wind chimes, a dozen others. The meeting descended into chaos, all of it directed at the pale, trembling woman at the front table. One of the homeowners, a CPA, stood on a chair and yelled over the din. "I call for a vote of no confidence in the president, and I demand a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances for the last 2 years." A roar of approval went up. Carol's face, which had been pale, was now bright red. She looked from the angry crowd to her crumbling board members, who were pointedly refusing to look at her. With a strangled cry of rage, she grabbed her purse, shoved her way through the crowd, and fled the clubhouse. The petty tyrant had been dethroned. The collapse of Carol's reign was swift and total. In the chaotic aftermath of that meeting, both Gary and Brenda, her two board cronies, resigned on the spot via email. A motion was passed by the remaining homeowners to install a temporary board, and Arthur, to his great surprise, was nominated and unanimously elected as the interim president. His first official act was to declare all fines issued under Carol's presidency null and void, pending a full review. A wave of relief washed over the community. The independent audit that had been demanded was the next shoe to drop, and it was a heavy one. The CPA who had called for it volunteered to lead the effort. What he found was worse than anyone expected. It wasn't just petty tyranny, it was outright fraud. Carol had been using the HOA's debit card for personal expenses, groceries, gasoline, even a few spa days, which she'd coded as miscellaneous landscape maintenance. But the real crime was in the invoices. She had created a shell company, a fake landscaping business, named Aesthetic Solutions LLC. She had been submitting fraudulent invoices from this non-existent company for thousands of dollars in services, such as tree pruning analysis and soil compliance testing. She would then approve the payments as HOA president and deposit the checks into a personal bank account she had set up under the company's name. She had embezzled over $20,000 from her neighbors in less than 2 years. When the audit report was presented to the community, the anger was replaced by a grim sense of betrayal. This wasn't just a power trip, it was theft. Armed with the irrefutable evidence from the audit, the interim board, led by Arthur, had no choice but to turn the entire file over to the district attorney's office. A criminal investigation was launched. My personal vindication was quiet but complete. I received a formal written apology from the new HOA board. All fines and threats against me were expunged from the records. The letter explicitly acknowledged the historical status of my barn and thanked me for bringing the matter to light, thereby saving the association from potentially catastrophic legal liability with the county. It was a deeply satisfying piece of mail to receive. Carol's downfall, on the other hand, was loud and public. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts of embezzlement and wire fraud. Her story made the local news. The woman who had been so obsessed with appearances and community standards was now the subject of public shame. Her perfectly manicured world had crumbled into a mugshot and a court date. She eventually took a plea bargain, pleading guilty to felony theft. The judge was not lenient. Her sentence included a year in county jail, 5 years of probation, and, most importantly, full financial restitution to the homeowners association. Her house went up for sale shortly after her conviction. The bank foreclosed on it to help pay her legal fees and the restitution she owed. Seeing the for sale sign go up on her beige box of a house felt like the final chapter closing. There was no joy in it, just a quiet sense of justice and the inevitable consequence of her own actions. She had been so worried about my barn dragging down property values, and in the end, her own criminal behavior was what truly tarnished the neighborhood's reputation for a time. With Carol gone and a new, reasonable board in place, the neighborhood began to breathe again. The first thing the new board did was to hold a series of town halls to rewrite the bylaws. They stripped out all the petty, vindictive, and ambiguous rules. The focus shifted from enforcement and punishment to community and cooperation. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded and replaced with a simple guideline: keep your property safe and reasonably tidy. The reign of the clipboard was over. Mrs. Gable's birdhouses and feeders went back up almost immediately. They seemed to attract more birds than ever, a cheerful, chirping symbol of our newfound freedom. The family with the basketball hoop left it out all summer, and the sound of kids playing became a welcome part of the neighborhood's soundscape. The oppressive quiet of Carol's reign was replaced by the gentle, ordinary sounds of life. I finally got back to work on my barn. With the full blessing of the community and the proper, easily obtained permit from the County Historical Commission, I began the restoration in earnest. It became a community project, in a way. Neighbors would stop by to see the progress, to admire the old joinery, or to ask about the history I had uncovered. Arthur was a frequent visitor, often bringing lemonade and offering unsolicited, but always interesting, historical tidbits about 18th century construction techniques. It took me the better part of a year, working weekends and evenings, but I finished it. I replaced the rotten wood, reglazed the old windows, and carefully patched the stone walls. The great doors, newly built to be exact replicas of the originals, swung open and closed with satisfying smoothness. The barn was no longer an eyesore, it was a landmark. It was magnificent. The new HOA board even asked if they could feature a picture of it on the cover of the community newsletter, a request I found deeply, satisfyingly ironic. About 2 years after the big meeting, I had one final, unexpected encounter with Carol. I was at a large garden center in the next town over, picking up supplies for a client. As I was loading bags of soil into my truck, I saw her. She was pushing a cart with a few sad-looking marigolds in it. She looked diminished. Her trademark helmet of hair was gone, replaced by a limp, unstyled cut. The self-righteous fire in her eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind something tired and empty. She saw me at the same moment. For a second, her face registered a flash of the old anger and resentment, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a look of weary shame. She ducked her head and quickly pushed her cart down a different aisle, trying to avoid me. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a strange, detached sense of pity. She had been the architect of her own destruction, a woman so consumed by a need for control that she had lost everything. I finished loading my truck and drove away, and I never saw her again. The whole experience taught me a few things. It taught me that bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, are often just a thin veneer of rules and bluster covering a core of insecurity. It taught me that a community is not about conformity, it's about the messy, beautiful, and sometimes inconvenient tapestry of the people within it. And it taught me that history, the truth of a place, can be a powerful shield against those who want to erase it in the name of a sterile, soulless progress. Today, Oak Creek Estates is a better place to live than it ever was. Property values, the thing Carol claimed to be protecting, have actually risen significantly. People are drawn to the neighborhood's reputation for being friendly, relaxed, and having a sense of genuine community. The restored barn has become a beloved local landmark. Photographers sometimes ask to take pictures of it for calendars, and the local historical society has put a small, tasteful bronze plaque near my driveway, detailing its history for passers-by. Sometimes in the evening, I sit on my back porch with a cold drink, looking out at the barn. The old stone seems to glow in the setting sun, and the timber frame stands silhouetted against the sky, a testament to endurance. It stood here long before I was born, and it will stand long after I'm gone. It weathered storms, changing seasons, and the passage of centuries. And, as it turned out, it was more than strong enough to weather the brief, turbulent reign of a petty tyrant. My home is quiet again, and my corner of history is safe. And that is a peace that no amount of HOA dues can ever buy.